seconds.
Thanks very much, Ceann Comhairle. Minister, this question has to be seen in the context of the claims by the Dublin Airport Authority that the development of the second runway will have very positive benefits in terms of the economy and job creation. And I've no doubt that that is true, but it's a very one-sided analysis if there isn't a full impact assessment on the emissions related and the environmental costs associated with the development. So I'm wondering what studies have been done in that regard.
That's Deputy Arda.
I'd like to thank Deputy Daly for substituting for Deputy Wallace. I'm not sure which is a more formidable adversary in this House this time, but I'll give you the same answer as I would have given Deputy Wallace. The Deputy will be aware that the DAA holds the statutory responsibility for the management, operation and development of Dublin Airport. In line with this responsibility, it's a matter for DAA to ensure that necessary infrastructure is in place to facilitate the development of the airport and that there is sufficient capacity to meet existing and future demand. It is my understanding that runway development was subject to a rigorous EIA as part of the full planning process. At that time, the EIS clearly stated the impacts of the runway on carbon emission would not be significant and that mitigation measures such as improved aircraft engine efficiency, efficient airport operations, and international climate agreements would address aviation carbon emissions. I also note that the 2020 national reduction targets under EU Effort Sharing Decision 406/2009 EC do not include international aircraft emissions, so the North Runway project will not have any direct impact on these targets. Aviation emissions are to be addressed separately under an agreement reached at the International Civil Aviation Organization, ICAO, in 2013 to establish a global market-based measure for aviation emissions. It is anticipated that the details of that global scheme to apply from 2020 will be finalized at the ICAO General Assembly in September 2016. Currently, aviation emissions from flights within the European Economic Area are subject to an emissions trading scheme, the EU ETS scheme. This scheme imposes a cap on the emissions of individual airlines such that all intra-EEA flights to and from Dublin Airport are covered by this scheme.
Things regarding the Minister's response. I mean, firstly, he is correct, of course, that the DAA are responsible for airport development, but the rigorous environmental impact assessment which was carried out will be 13 years old by the time the new runway is operational in 2020. And obviously our understanding of emissions and climate change has developed even since that original permission was given almost 10 years ago now. I suppose one of the difficulties is that we had originally tabled these questions for the Minister for Climate Change, only to have them referred back to the Minister for Transport, which I think there's a certain conflict of interest in that regard. And so, some of the issues are very pertinent. I mean, obviously aviation is responsible for about 5% of global carbon emissions. Some best practice environmentalists would say that there should be a moratorium actually on usage. But if you look at Dublin, and particularly post-Brexit, the amount of passengers that Dublin now gets and the amount they would need to offset the costs of the second runway is inevitably going to drive up the number of flights and inevitably then as a consequence the emissions, and I think at the very least a revised analysis of this will be necessary.
Minister.
I think the Deputy will probably be aware that at the moment the DAA is in the process of examining the scope of a further environmental impact statement for the purposes of seeking a review of the operating restrictions foreseen for Dublin Airport under the existing planning permission for the North Runway, and have recently gone to public consultation on this matter. This consultation provides an opportunity to contribute to the content of an approach adopted in the EIS.
See, the problem with that is the new scoping exercise for the new EIS is, as the Minister says, to look at lifting the restrictions that were imposed on the planning permission, which is almost 10 years old. Now, there's a real problem with that from a number of fronts. Firstly, our understanding of the impact of noise and environmental damage from aviation has progressed substantially in the last 10 years. And yet, even if you like, at our lower level of understanding, the board Planola decided that their permission could only be given with these restrictions, and yet it is now precisely these restrictions which the Dublin Airport Authority are attempting to lift, which will undoubtedly have an enormous impact. And in actual fact, the Minister says that they've done that as part of the new process. Well, in actual fact, they're not really sure why they're doing it or where the information from that scoping exercise is going to go, because it really depends on what the Minister does in transcribing EU Directive 598/14, which is the subject of other questions on the agenda which won't be reached. But maybe the Minister could enlighten us as to how he's going to deal with the transcribing of that directive.
Minister, if you can be brief, please.
Yeah, I'll be brief. I certainly will. The issue I think we discussed here before, and the issue of emissions is obviously separate from the other issues of noise, and they have to be separated in any case, and they will both be addressed, and I think be vigorously addressed. What I can assure the Deputy, as I have done before, is that I will be watching very closely the activities in the DAA in mitigating the noise, and I can give her the assurances which I gave her in the House before, that it is imperative that the interests of the residents are certainly looked after, and that the inconveniences that they have suffered, the disturbance they have suffered, must be regarded as a very high priority, and that the mitigating measures must be adequate and must satisfy normal, decent standards, so that people are not disturbed to an extent which makes their lives miserable, but while the runway can go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Minister.